Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I will tell you about the neighbor who broke my irrigation system on the farm. I grew up in a peaceful rural area, the kind of place where you could leave your doors unlocked at night, and the only real problem you had to deal with was an occasional coyote wandering onto the property. When I was in my early 20s, my parents entrusted me with this farmland that has been in our family for 3 generations. Over the years, I've done everything I can to keep up its reputation for producing wonderful crops, nurturing a small orchard, and caring for a modest vineyard that has become my pride and joy. All along, I tried to maintain a friendly relationship with neighbors, old and new. We're all living out here side by side, so why not get along? I never thought someone could rile me up as much as my neighbor Karen did recently. The conflict started in a deceptively small way, and yet it escalated faster than I could have imagined. Let me set the stage. Karen is relatively new to the area, having moved in about a year ago. Prior to her arrival, the property next to mine was owned by a sweet older couple who rarely left their house except to wave at me from their porch. After they moved to be closer to their children, this new neighbor purchased the property. Right from the beginning, Karen made her presence known. She demanded the local roads be repaved, even though the county had no budget for that. She also insisted on her right to erect large privacy fences, even though high fences are generally frowned upon in this part of the community because they block the scenic views everyone shares. She was outspoken, brash, and, as I would soon learn, completely unafraid to throw around threats if she felt she wasn't getting her way. At first, I tried to stay neutral. I'm not one for neighborhood squabbles, especially since my main focus is my land, crops, and the orchard. The orchard, for context, is on the northern side of my property, sitting parallel to Karen's newly acquired home. Most of my irrigation system lines run beneath that section because that's where I need consistent watering. Typically, if a neighbor wants to do something near the property line, like installing a fence or trimming trees that hang over, common courtesy and sometimes local regulations say they should notify me so I can mark where irrigation lines are or let them know if they're straying onto my property. But Karen? She never asked. She barely greeted me when she first arrived, other than offering a quick wave before hurrying inside. I should have expected something eventually would go wrong. One day, about 2 months ago, I noticed quite a bit of activity on Karen's side of the fence. Trucks were rolling in and out of her driveway, loaded with tree trimming equipment, wood chippers, and large saws. I didn't think much of it at first, because she does have a lot of tall trees that had gone a bit wild. Trimming them wasn't a bad idea, and I figured she had the right to manage her property however she saw fit. However, what I didn't anticipate was just how aggressively the workers would do their job, or how poorly Karen would supervise them. She evidently told them, "Trim these branches back as far as you can," or so one of them later told me in a conversation that took place well after everything went down. The problem started with a line of old walnut trees standing on the boundary. These trees were legally on Karen's side, but they had grown wide, with some branches creeping into my orchard. I don't mind that, since I always try to keep natural boundaries somewhat flexible, especially if they're old. But apparently, Karen decided she wanted them trimmed drastically, perhaps out of fear that leaves might blow onto her lawn or branches might drop on her property. If that's what she wanted, fine, but she was supposed to inform me if the workers would be doing any kind of activity near or over my line that might impact my own property. That courtesy never happened. When the day's work was underway, I was out back. Our properties are so large that sometimes I can't hear or see everything that's going on near the shared boundary, especially when I'm several acres away, tending to chores or checking on the vineyard. By the time I realized the extent of what was happening, I could already see from a distance that a huge chunk of one branch had been sliced off and was dangling precariously over my side of the fence. It was only when I walked over that I discovered the real problem. The workers had parked their heavy trucks and trailers on the edge of my land, presumably to get better access to the big walnut branches. And since they didn't exactly ask me or check the area first, they'd flattened a portion of my irrigation lines that ran underground. The worst part is that my irrigation system for that side of the orchard isn't just a simple above-ground setup. It's a carefully installed combination of subterranean pipes and drip lines. I spent a good deal of money on that system over the years. It's not easy or cheap to fix. One pass of a heavy truck can crack those lines pretty badly, causing leaks. While I was assessing the damage, a couple of the workers seemed apologetic. One even told me that they had assumed it was safe because their boss, hired by Karen, told them, "Don't worry, we have permission to be here." I certainly never gave them permission to drive onto my property. I confronted them, asking who told them they could park here, but they pointed me in the direction of Karen. I tried to keep my cool. I figured we could handle this like adults. I took my phone out and began snapping photos of the flattened drip lines and the tire marks. I also captured some pictures of the fallen branches that had crashed down on my side, smashing a few of my smaller plants. It wasn't catastrophic yet, but definitely an unwelcome shock. I felt I had to document everything just in case. Once I had enough evidence, I walked over to Karen, who was standing near her front porch directing one of the workers about which branches should be cut next. She didn't even notice I was there until I cleared my throat. "Hey, Karen," I said, trying to keep my tone polite. "We need to talk. Your workers ran over my irrigation lines and there's some damage. I have photos if you want to see." Karen turned to me, gave me a once-over as though I were tracking mud across her pristine marble floors. Which, ironically, I wasn't even on her land at that point. I was on the boundary. The first words out of her mouth were, "You can't prove anything. I have no idea what you're talking about." I held out my phone and opened the gallery, showing her the crushed lines and tire tracks that led from her property straight onto mine. I pointed out that this damage was consistent with her workers' vehicles. Her response was simply, "That proves nothing, don't even try." Then she squared her shoulders, and before I could get another word in, she dropped what I can only describe as a threat-laced bombshell. "If you say one more word about this, I'm calling the police." I was stunned. I was the one with the damaged property, the evidence, and yet she was threatening me. If the roles were reversed, I'd be mortified and trying to figure out how to make amends. But not Karen. No, she just wanted to scare me into silence. That's not how it works around here. I told her exactly that. That's not how things work. This is my land, and you damaged my property. She gave me this almost triumphant smirk, pulled her phone out of her pocket, dialed, and began an over-the-top performance for whoever was on the other end. I could hear the general gist of it, and she was twisting the facts. She went on and on about how I had trespassed onto her property, harassed her, threatened her workers, and was trying to sabotage her tree trimming operation. She even told them I was trying to extort money from her. The entire conversation was a fabrication from start to finish. I tried to interject, but she just held a finger to her lips, a silent shh, as if to say I should stay quiet or face the consequences. The meltdown was so absurd it would have been almost comical, if not for the fact that my irrigation system was literally destroyed in parts. Now, up until that moment, she had no idea I keep a few security cameras on my property. Most of them are near my house and workshop, but I also have 2 cameras installed on tall posts that oversee parts of my orchard. They're not exactly hidden, but they're not in plain sight either, as they blend with the environment. They're primarily there to discourage trespassers and to document anything suspicious that might happen near my barn or orchard. It's a precaution I took after a small rash of equipment thefts in the region a couple of years ago. Thanks to those cameras, not only did I have photos on my phone of the aftermath, but I also had video footage of exactly how the workers drove over my irrigation lines while branches fell in areas where they shouldn't have. I had proof Karen either knew or should have known what was happening, because one of the cameras caught her standing there, watching them park in that area. I didn't confront her with that evidence right then and there. Instead, I decided to take a step back, because she was already on the phone, presumably with the police or maybe a friend she was using as a scare tactic. Either way, I felt it best to let her think she'd intimidated me into backing off. I quietly walked away, ignoring the rude gestures she made in my direction. Later that day, sure enough, a couple of local officers came by my place to ask what happened because apparently there was a complaint. I calmly explained the situation, mentioned the broken irrigation lines, and showed them the pictures on my phone. The officers were polite and professional. One of them asked if I had any more evidence. At that point, I let them know that I did, in fact, have video footage. They seemed relieved to see that I had real, tangible proof. So how do we get from there to me taking Karen to court? Well, it started with me filing a property damage claim. Normally, you can handle these matters by going through insurance. Sometimes you can also have a polite conversation with a neighbor if you believe it was an accident. Yet Karen's reaction was so hostile, so blatantly uncooperative, that I didn't see any alternative. That same evening, I reviewed the footage more carefully. It showed the workers' truck wheels rolling right over my irrigation lines, while Karen stood no more than a few feet away, supervising. Even after it happened, she walked over to look at the flattened pipes for a moment, before seemingly shrugging and walking away. I first tried to handle it through a formal letter requesting payment for repairs. My attorney helped me draft it. We made sure to include estimates for the damages and politely requested that Karen cover the cost of replacing the destroyed lines, damaged drip emitters, and some of the plants that had been crushed by branches. The estimate was a few $1,000s because these irrigation lines aren't cheap, and labor costs for reinstalling them can be hefty. We also included a copy of a screenshot from the footage as a courtesy, so she'd know we had evidence. Karen's response through an email was nothing short of astonishing. She claimed I was committing fraud, that she had recorded a phone call where I supposedly admitted it was my fault. That was a complete lie. Then she said she had spoken to important people at the county who assured her that anything on the boundary belongs to both of us, so she had the right to do what she pleased. The orchard, according to her, was encroaching on her property. None of this was correct legally. She refused to pay a single cent and ended her email by promising to see me in court, followed by a rather obnoxious exclamation of, "Good luck with your non-existent case." My attorney read that email and raised an eyebrow. It looked like it was going to be a full-blown legal conflict, which is exactly what ended up happening. During this time, I also discovered that Karen had done a few other questionable things around the community. For instance, she had threatened an elderly neighbor over some shrubs that grew near her side of their shared fence. She had also tried to claim that the public road near her driveway was private property, placing homemade no trespassing signs along the ditch. Local authorities removed them, clarifying that she had no right to restrict public roads. Given these patterns, I wasn't too surprised she was going to push back on my rightful claim. While preparing for our day in court, I had the irrigation lines partially repaired so I could keep watering my orchard, but I kept all the old, cracked pieces of pipe and recorded the entire repair process, including the receipts from the company that came out to do the work. Meanwhile, I gathered statements from the workers who, by that point, felt that Karen had thrown them under the bus. One of them reached out to me, apologizing for what happened, saying that if they had known the land belonged to me, they wouldn't have parked there, but they were told by Karen that it was her property. That worker was willing to write a signed statement explaining the situation. I also had one of the workers confirm that Karen stood there and watched as they drove onto the orchard, disregarding any potential damage. When the day came for the court hearing, I arrived with my attorney, a binder of documents and photos, and a DVD that contained the video footage from my security cameras. I also had the broken irrigation segments in my car just in case. Karen showed up without a lawyer, which was surprising, but also typical of someone who thinks they can bluff their way out of anything. The judge was patient but firm, asking me to present my evidence first. I explained how I discovered the damage, showed the pictures, and then introduced the video footage. Karen's face went from smug defiance to what looked like genuine panic. She clearly hadn't expected me to have actual video showing the events. The judge reviewed the footage, saw the trucks crossing onto my property, the large branch falling directly onto my plants, and recognized Karen in the corner of the camera's frame, overseeing it all. The judge asked Karen if she had anything to say in response. She tried to ramble about me trespassing on her property, but the judge wasn't amused. The judge reminded her we were here about my property's damage, not an unrelated trespassing claim, especially since the police already had a look at her false complaint. Karen tried to pivot, claiming the orchard was on the boundary, so it was essentially her right to do whatever she wanted. Then she said she had a phone conversation where I admitted wrongdoing, but she provided no evidence of this supposed call. At that point, the judge calmly explained that property boundaries are a matter of public record, and from the evidence provided, including surveys I had attached to the letter, it was clear that the portion with the irrigation lines was on my side. The judge also stated that the video alone was compelling evidence that damage had indeed occurred due to Karen's instructions. When it was time for the final ruling, I was awarded the total cost of repairing the irrigation system, plus some additional compensation for the damage done to the orchard plants. The judge also decided Karen would be responsible for my legal fees because she had been so uncooperative, and there was proof she acted maliciously, at least in the sense that she threatened me over a legitimate complaint. Her attempt to call the police and make false statements only made her look worse in the eyes of the court, though no separate criminal action was taken against her for that. It's worth noting, in some parts of the country, providing false statements to the police can carry serious consequences. Perhaps the judge decided focusing on the property damage claim was enough for the civil hearing. Regardless, I was satisfied. My orchard would be compensated, and Karen was told by the court that she had no right to direct workers onto my land. But that's not the end of the story. A few days after the verdict, Karen started some bizarre passive-aggressive antics. She installed a tall fence along the boundary line, presumably to annoy me. However, she didn't realize that our county requires a permit for fencing over a certain height, especially near roads or property lines. I guess she thought if she kept it on her side, she could do whatever she pleased. Within a week, the county building inspector came out and told her she either had to take it down or apply for a permit and possibly shorten it. Part of me couldn't help but wonder if I should have given her a friendly heads up, but I decided not to since she hadn't bothered to communicate or follow rules herself. She ended up having to pay a fine for erecting a non-compliant fence without a permit. I didn't have to do anything to make that happen. The county acts on its own. Meanwhile, my orchard was recovering well. The repair crew finished replacing all the broken lines, tested the system, and everything was back to normal in a couple of weeks. My attorney told me Karen had tried to file an appeal, but it never went anywhere, most likely because the evidence was so heavily against her. At some point, she must have realized further legal struggles would just drain her finances even more. Part of me hoped that would be the end of Karen's interference, but she still tried to poke at me in smaller ways. She once left a note on my gate, accusing me of letting leaves from my orchard blow into her yard. That made me roll my eyes because how can I possibly control where the wind blows leaves? Another time, she claimed my security cameras were spying on her. But again, those cameras are pointed at my orchard, not at her personal property. She'd have a tough time proving any invasion of privacy, especially since our county's guidelines state that security cameras directed at your own property are perfectly legal as long as they aren't focused on someone else's private space. Since everything had been so tense, I tried to maintain a cordial distance. I didn't go out of my way to greet her or anything. If we crossed paths while leaving our respective driveways, I'd simply nod. Yet occasionally she'd glare at me, sometimes even pulling out her phone as if she wanted to film me. She seemed determined to catch me doing something questionable. But I'm not the type of person who does anything illegal or shady. I'm mostly out in the orchard, greenhouse, or occasionally heading to town for supplies. Good luck to her if she thinks she'll capture me in some kind of wrongdoing. One interesting twist, a few of Karen's friends started showing up more often after the court case. I'd see cars parked on her driveway, groups of them chatting loudly, sometimes pointing in my direction. There was even one evening when I heard them yelling. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like they were having an argument. The next morning, I found a small sign had been hammered into the ground near the boundary line on her side, reading, "No orchard trespassers, violators will be prosecuted." I just laughed and left it there, because it was a sign on her property, referring to me, who had never once trespassed on her side. By that point, the local police knew the real story, and I suspect they wouldn't be very receptive to another round of false claims from Karen. Another subplot that emerged was with the local community group that organizes farm tours. We have an informal association of farmers and orchard owners who sometimes open their gates to local families, schools, or tourists interested in seeing how produce is grown. I've been part of this association for years, hosting small educational tours. Because Karen's property is next door, if there's any large event, she'd see the line of cars and people walking around. I always keep the tours on my property, but one day, a couple of curious visitors stepped off the designated path and wandered along the boundary line. Karen apparently lost her temper and came outside yelling that I was encouraging people to trespass. In reality, I had no clue they had left the marked path. I apologized to the tourists and reminded them to stay within the orchard boundaries. They apologized profusely, but Karen's meltdown was so loud it drew everyone's attention. The only upside was that a few members of the community group realized how out of hand Karen's behavior was. One of them commented to me privately, "I'm so sorry you have to deal with her." It wasn't long before my orchard camera caught Karen pacing the boundary line at odd hours, presumably checking to see if I'd placed anything near the property line. In one clip, she's out there with a measuring tape, but she seems confused as to what she's measuring. I assume she was trying to see if there was some code violation on my side that she could report. She never found anything to use against me because I've been extremely careful to follow every local rule and code. I file for permits when needed, keep my property well maintained, and don't infringe on her land. Ironically, her daily rants and attempts to get me in trouble backfired. They confirmed my decision to install security cameras to avoid false accusations. Since I saved all relevant footage, I felt safe if she lied again. I even invited the local police to check my camera logs if she calls them again for something false. One officer said Karen made many calls but never made a decent complaint. He also advised me to stay away, not engage, and keep all documents in case she tried anything else legally. She calmed down after months. Karen started renovating her kitchen and living room, according to a neighbor. Community suspected she was flipping or valuing the property. I don't know because I didn't want to talk to her, but direct harassment slowed. Perhaps the lawsuit's financial impact and her frustration at not being able to blame me made her realize she was wasting her time. Meanwhile, I invested the settlement money in better fencing on my side to fully outline my orchard boundary, including clear signage that read, "Private property, authorized personnel only." My crops benefited from upgrading the orchard's soil sensors and drip system with some of the funds. I used the chaos to improve my property. However, a local real estate agent friend warned me that Karen's property value may drop if she continues to fight with neighbors. Small groups talk. If a buyer knows the neighbor is fighting, they may not buy. Karen would probably blame me for that too, even though I've only defended my property and legal rights. When everything was resolved, I wondered what Karen could do to retaliate. She has little legal recourse. She unsuccessfully filed trespassing charges. Her attempt to deny responsibility for my irrigation system damage failed. She failed to get me in trouble with zoning or building codes. I always had the truth and thorough documentation. One small note. The worker who gave me the signed statement told me they were leaving that tree trimming company because of the whole fiasco. They said Karen yelled at them, demanded dangerous shortcuts to finish faster, and accused them of incompetence when they did things right. They apologized again for parking on my property and told me I was right. I thanked them and told them I didn't hold a grudge against them because they were mostly following their boss's orders, or Karen's, according to them. Overall, Karen's bullying failed. She paid well. The community knows who she is. According to those who have disputed her property lines, she's unpopular. I wonder if she'll sell and leave. I won't cry if that happens. The lesson of this ordeal: document everything and defend yourself. Be fearless when someone threatens to call the police on you for something you didn't do. Karen lied on her phone, which surprised me. It was aggravating and intrusive. However, the security cameras made a he said, she said case simple. In places with well-defined property laws, persistence will reveal the truth. I'm glad I kept calm and methodical. If I had yelled and made false accusations like her, things would have been different. I won in court, and Karen looked foolish for her brazen threats. I occasionally see her glaring from behind her recently trimmed trees or the fence she was forced to shorten. I sometimes nod politely when I catch her eye. I recommend ignoring her antics and letting her actions speak for themselves. No more drama, please. She can threaten me, but I know my rights. She learned the hard way that yelling about calling the police or exaggerating stories won't protect her. I wrote this lengthy account to cover every aspect of the conflict, from the initial property damage to my evidence collection methods to the legal battle's surprising turns and the final outcome. I hope others in similar situations realize they're not powerless. Despite your neighbor being the hardest person on earth, you can protect your land and rights. If they truly violate your property, the law can protect you if you do it right. I discovered local building codes, property lines, and the importance of staying calm under pressure. Karen could have accused me of harassment if I had resorted to screaming matches and intimidation. Civility, thoroughness, and patience were crucial. It seems some people can't admit their mistakes. Pride or fear of consequences makes them double down, thinking they can bluff their way out of trouble. Karen tried that, saying I couldn't prove anything. I surprised her with all the footage and documentation. If she had apologized immediately and offered to fix the damage, this would not have become a lawsuit. She would have saved money. She suffered for her stubbornness. One last legal note. An attorney friend told me that false police reports can lead to charges, but intent is hard to prove. Since Karen's false statements fell apart quickly, the police likely saw it as a case of she said, you said, and since my camera footage cleared me, they didn't waste resources. If she had pursued a false criminal charge, she could have been punished. Her plan failed, and she had to pay my civil court damages. A way was found for justice. Friends, thank you. See you soon.